Hello, good people. It is great to be back with you. I am recording this quite late at night, and so I hope that my voice is not too tired and that it will hold out for this video. But that's been something that I've been thinking about for a number of days, and I've gotten to the point where it's so much on my heart that I don't think I can really sleep unless I get it out and onto the video. So I hope this ends up being presentable enough that you will be able um, to listen to it and appreciate it. And so here goes. um, in First Chronicles 12:32, and talks about the people of Israel who are going to be the supporters of King David coming to amass an army in his support. And among the people who come, according to that particular verse, it mentions the men of Issachar and calls them men who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. And I thought of this verse in light of Jonathan Pajot's recent video, A Call to Christian Artists, where he talked about the sense that he has of the times in which we are living, how perilous they are, and how the ground seems to be shifting underneath our feet. And so that is kind of what I wanted to talk about. I want to talk about the events with COVID-19, the events over the past year, it's a little over a year now, and some of the things that we have learned as we have gone through that. And what I'm questioning is whether we whether we have among us a sense of understanding the times and of knowing what we should do, or whether we have people that we can look to who understand the times and know what we should do. So let's just review a few things that we have learned over this past year. So first of all, let's talk about masks for a minute. Now, it's very logical to think that masks would protect you if you're in an environment where there are infectious agents about. And certainly I thought so. When the pandemic first started coming our way, I was telling my husband that I wanted him to wear a mask at work, and he did. At the time that the pandemic was starting around the early part of last year, I had had some medical treatment that had really lowered my immune system, and so I was quite nervous about the illness and the possibility of getting it, and I really wanted to be protected. Now, one of the things I was unaware of was that there had been a number of studies previous to last year by medical professionals and researchers to find out whether masks protected people from a viral infection. And actually, they had found that masks were very ineffective. I mean, who knew? I mean, how many of us who, ordinary people who were not involved in the medical profession or had some reason to be reading research papers on this, had ever run across the information or would have any reason to investigate the information about the efficacy of masks? It seemed logical to think that masks would be protective. And so when we were told that the public should not wear masks, originally, we were kind of mystified about that. Then there was the theory that the only reason they told us that was they wanted to save the masks for the medical professionals. And then they came out and told us that we ought to go ahead and wear masks. And in many places, masks started being required. And at first, that seemed reasonable. But as the year went by, we began to learn that there had been these previous studies about the efficacy of masks and that they didn't work for viral infections. And then we got the real-time data. We had the actual experience in various populations of having populations wearing masks and not wearing masks. We had some places where there were mask mandates, and we had places where there were not mask mandates. We had places where there was high compliance with mask mandates and places where there was low compliance. we accumulated over the course of the last year a lot of data. What that data shows is exactly what the previous studies in years past had shown, that there is almost no effect on the transmission of the virus among populations that wear masks and populations that don't. Doesn't make a difference. The masks don't work the way we thought they would. This is counterintuitive, but it is something that we have learned over the past year. Well, so then it's natural to ask the question, if that has become evident and if that's what the data shows, that the masks are not protecting us from the virus, then why are we still being required in certain places to wear masks? I will say around the area that I live that when you go into stores, you see some people with masks and some people without, even though there's a sign on all the doors that says masks are required. The compliance level has really fallen off a great deal. And I have not been wearing a mask in any public place for a number of months, and I'll tell you what has happened to me from not wearing a mask. Nothing. Nothing has happened to me. I have not gotten sick. I have not gotten arrested. Nobody has yelled at me. Nobody has looked at me cross-eyed or anything. I have not had any issues from not wearing masks. And you probably will not have any issues if you don't wear a mask either. So if the mask is not effective, why are you bothering to wear it? If the mask is not effective, why are other people trying to get people to wear the mask? It's a question we really need to ask. Another thing that we've learned over the past year is that lockdowns of a population to try to prevent the spread of the virus are also ineffective. Again, once again, this seems a bit counterintuitive. At first, it seemed like, well, that may be a good idea to keep everybody kind of still and from moving around too much, maybe for a couple of weeks. Remember, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, that kind of thing, that keep the hospitals from being overwhelmed and all that. And it turns out that if you look at the data that has come in from all different kinds of communities, from the various states, various countries, etc., that the lockdowns did not prevent the spread of the virus. You cannot see a difference in the way the virus has affected populations that locked down versus populations that just let their citizens go free and didn't bother to lock them down. There is no difference. It's not, in fact, in many cases, places that don't lock down actually fare better than places that have locked down. You have no evidence that lockdowns are doing anything for anyone. Well, that's something else that we've learned over the past year. Another thing that we learned, who knew this? Who knew that testing for a virus would be something that could be manipulated by changing the cycle threshold in the PCR test? That's something else we learned. We learned that it's possible to make it look like there's a high rate of infection depending on how you run the test. And you can make it look like there's a very high rate of infection among a population, and you could make it look like there's a lower rate of infection among another population just by how many cycles they run for the PCR test. And therefore, a lot of the data that we get claiming that infection rates are going up and stuff like that is not trustworthy. We can't trust the data. We also can't easily compare data between different places based on how they happen to be running the test. The other thing we found out is that there's a lot of confusion between the infection rate and the case rate. So cases were people who actually had symptoms and got sick, whereas infections were people who were tested and tested positive. And not all the people who were infected and tested positive were actually cases because they were not actually sick. At the same time, we learned that, and this is all over the past year, that this theory that people could be asymptomatic and be spreading the virus was not really a thing. Now, that was kind of posited early last year as a real problem, and it was the reason given why people needed to be in lockdown and needed to have masks on and all that. But we learned that that's not really a driver of infection, asymptomatic spread. We learned that probably the chief way that people got the virus was from their own family members in their own home, rather than by catching it from someone outside of their home. So this business of asymptomatic spread was one of these things that had been, like the mask business, that had been understood previously. In fact, when it was first mentioned, and many of us didn't know this because we weren't paying attention, I sure didn't, but when it was first mentioned, the idea of asymptomatic spread, many of the experts in virology and public health just laughed at it. They said, such a thing doesn't exist. But when it became obvious that it could be a factor that would make people very afraid and get them to comply with all the restrictions, then it started being something that everybody talked about and everybody became afraid of. That has been gradually abandoned, and it's been admitted that it's not a driver of infection. So it was, previously understood before COVID-19, then it was trotted out when it seemed that it could get people to comply. It started being abandoned again, but now it's starting to be dragged out once again for the concept that after you get vaccinated, you should wear a mask. So your after-vax attire would include a mask because, once again, this boogeyman of asymptomatic spread is coming up. We learned that the 6-foot rule, one thing we've learned over the past year is that the 6-foot rule, and we just learned this recently, was just made up. There was no science behind it. It was completely made up. Once again, a kind of intuitive thing, right? Well, if I stay, this number of feet away from a person and they're infectious, I won't get infectious. I'll keep my distance from them and wear a mask to protect them. They're keeping their distance from me and they're wearing a mask to protect me. We're all protecting each other, and aren't we just all being very compassionate with one another and doing our duty as citizens, but all this stuff. And it turns out that that whole 6-foot rule was something that was just completely made up. We learned that the virus rarely spreads out of doors. And we learned this while people were being mainly confined indoors, where the virus does have more of a tendency to spread. We learned that the virus, thank God for this, we learned that the virus very rarely made children ill, and neither were children vectors for the transmission of the virus, which is good. That's a good thing, because when it first started, there was certainly a lot of concern on the part of everyone that it might badly affect children, and that would have been a terrible tragedy if we had started losing children to this virus. However, the fact that children were not vectors for the transmission of the virus did not stop the teachers who found out that they could get paid for not teaching. They wanted to continue having that very cushy situation of being paid while they didn't do their job. And so they were not very reluctant to go back into the school. In certain districts, you couldn't get them back in school with a crowbar. Meanwhile, some parents who were exposed for the first time to the content that their children were learning in their classes via Zoom have decided that you won't get their children back in public school, crowbar or no crowbar. One of the things we learned this past year is that cheap, widely available, long-use treatments like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin would be suppressed, that studies about them would be fabricated or falsified, and even very prestigious research institutions and medical publications would have to retract their statements about these drugs, that doctors who successfully use them to save lives would be demonized and canceled. And all of this so that very expensive new treatments would be used instead. And along with this, we learned something else. And this is kind of a black pill. And it's been a real bitter thing to swallow for a lot of people. And it's this: you can be killed. Thousands and perhaps hundreds of thousands of people have been killed by the withholding of these treatments. Many of us already understood that the pharmaceutical industry, especially in the United States, has determined that it can mine the health of the American people for profit. But this situation went beyond even what we already knew when it came to the exploitation of the health of the population for profit, and the capture of the regulatory bodies, and the coordination between media companies and pharmaceutical companies. There are some people who want you dead. They want me dead. It's not personal. It's just business. It's just calculation. They would like for us to die, and especially to die in a rather long, slow, painful way that provides them with the maximum profit. It is not an innocent misjudgment. It's not a mere unintended consequence. It's not a side effect. We have to swallow this, as black a pill as it is. Many deaths that happened this past year, were foreseen and intended as a way to amp up the fear that would keep the emergency status of this situation going. Because the new so-called vaccines, which are not FDA approved, are only approved under emergency authorization. To have an emergency use authorization, you have to have an emergency, and you don't have an emergency if you have effective treatment and prophylactics that are available and can be used by the population so that the emergency no longer is there. This has led to us understanding, as difficult as it is to kind of wrap our minds around the evil and malevolence of it, how deep the corruption is in every worldly institution. As we see the government bureaucrats collude with the media and the tech businesses to lie and gaslight us. Another thing that we've learned is that medical privacy has become an antiquated concept. It seems like only yesterday that there was all the brouhaha about HIPAA. Remember HIPAA, the Health Information Patient Privacy Act? Remember all those forms that we have to sign at the doctor's office to make sure that our privacy is being respected about our medical treatment? Well, now everyone wants everyone else to know about their vaccine status. And everyone thinks that everyone else's vaccine status is their business. So we had a message from the bishop of, or the Archbishop of Atlanta, who let us know that he has taken the new COVID vaccine, one of the new COVID vaccines. He wants us to know that he took it. It's like, I don't care. I don't care if the Archbishop takes the vaccine. I don't care if any particular person takes the vaccine. I don't care about the Archbishop's last details of the Archbishop's last colonoscopy, or you know, how he's doing on his toe fungus treatment, or what his liver enzyme levels are, or you know, his perio numbers, or anything else about his health. I don't consider that to be my business, and I don't know why he's making it everyone else's business. If he wants to, fine, go ahead. But my the cynicism about that is that it's become a little game of, you know, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. So that now that he's told us that he's taken the vaccine, he's going to think that maybe it's his business, or maybe it's the business of our priest to know whether we take the vaccine. As a matter of fact, there's a parish, a Catholic parish, I think it's somewhere in Florida, I'm not sure exactly, but I saw a picture of it, and the parish is seating people on different sides of the church based on whether they're vaccinated or unvaccinated. So there's a vaccinated side and there's an unvaccinated side. We've got a new court of the Gentiles here, people. And if we're, you know, if we're going to start dividing the church up like this with people's, based on people's health and medical stuff, I get my own ideas about how they ought to do that. I want all the people who are doing keto to sit on one side, and I want all the people who have insulin resistance to sit on the other side. Maybe, maybe we ought to reserve a pew in the back somewhere for all the people who are being treated for STDs. How about we have a couple of rows for the vegans so that I can mock them mentally for their stupidity as I'm going up to Holy Communion? You know, maybe we need to have a corner, one of the corners where we collect together all the people who are on psychotropic medication, so we'll know where all the crazies are. What could possibly go wrong with this idea of having sections in the church based on people's medical status of something? And how is that not a violation of your medical privacy? That's what I want to know. I'll tell you what, it's gotten completely insane. And one of the problems with this is that I look at situations like this, I look at the continuation of the mask mandate stuff where the churches seem to be the ones that are doubling and tripling down on every jot and tittle of every tyrannical little regulation that comes from any government functionary, and wanting to bend over backwards or just bend over to demonstrate their enthusiastic adoption of every single one of these regulations or recommendations or whatever. And why? What, again, what do you think could possibly go wrong with the church volunteering to be an enforcement arm for government regulations that have to do with public health? You know, can you not imagine? Do you not have a good enough imagination to recognize the danger in these things? What has happened to our leadership? Why is it that we do not have men who understand the times? Because that is how I feel. I feel like the leadership of the church is not understanding the times. They're not standing up to these government requirements. I think a lot of it is fear. Some people have said that it has to do with the insurance companies, that all of the restrictions are based on them being afraid of being sued. I understand. I understand that. The church is always a big target on its back when it comes to the idea of lawsuits. And I know all the bishops have to be very careful about that kind of stuff. And I don't blame them for that. I mean, that's the money contributed by the parishioners that they're protecting, and they ought to be protecting it, and they ought to be conscious of it. But it seems like they're going way beyond what are reasonable requirements. In my parish, they're trying to get people to wear masks in the parking lot. After you leave the mass, you're not supposed to remove your mask until you get in your car. Can't even stand outside and talk to your friends and see their faces. It's bad enough we got to sit through the whole mass with masks on our faces. Now you're supposed to wear them in the parking lot where the virus does not even transmit outside. It can be a breezy spring day, and we're supposed to stand around there with masks to talk to people. People aren't doing it. People are not standing around talking. The entire sociability of the parish is just about dissolved because of this thing. And I just have to say that when I hear things like this, a requirement, and somebody might say, well, the bishop has the right to tell you to wear a mask. It's his parking lot. No, he doesn't. He doesn't have the right to tell me to wear a mask in the parking lot, because he doesn't have the right to require anything that is unreasonable, and that is unreasonable. What if the bishop told us that we all had to wear bunny tails and hop to our cars because that would protect us from the virus? Would we do it? No. We don't have to do silly things. We're Catholic. We're supposed to be intelligent. So we don't have to do any silly thing that somebody comes up with just because they say so. They have to have a reason, and there has to be some kind of evidence. And there is no evidence that we should have to wear masks in the parking lot. I will say this, though, as annoying as it is to have to wear a mask at Mass, I am encouraged by the idea that the bishops and the priests can tell people what to wear at Mass. Because if you can tell women to cover their faces, or people to cover their faces in masks, now, that means that there is no excuse for not telling people to cover their rear ends and their boobs in Mass from now on. You have demonstrated that you think you have the authority to tell someone what to wear at Mass. So I should not have to go through the kind of thing that I sometimes go through, kneeling in the pew with my 14-year-old grandson next to me, and we're kneeling in the pew before we go up to Holy Communion, and then the pew ahead of us goes up first, and the woman in the pew ahead of us stands up and puts her spandex covered rear end right in the face of my 14-year-old grandson, causing me to have thoughts of violence right before I go to communion. I shouldn't have to put up with that anymore. If you can tell me to cover my face in Mass, you can tell these women in their yoga pants to cover themselves up when they come to Mass from now on. No more excuses about that. You obviously think you have the authority to tell people what to wear to Mass. Start using it and start insisting on modesty in the house of God. Well, those are my thoughts. I may be kind of all over the place on this one, but I had to get this stuff off of my chest. I am really disappointed in what's been going on, especially in the response of the leadership of the church with this thing, and the way they seem to be intent on doing nothing but currying favor with these tyrannical government officials. What I want to see are, please, men who understand the times and know what Israel should do, and wearing masks and keeping our distance from our friends, and being forced to carry vaccine passports and trusting companies that have already demonstrated that they're willing to kill people to make a buck. I don't think those are the things that Israel should do. Thanks for listening to me tonight. I'm glad I got this off my chest. I think I'll be able to sleep tonight. And until we're together again, treat yourself as though you are someone you are responsible for helping, because you are responsible. So am I. And together we are making the world. Bye for now. Thanks so much for watching.